Hello YouTube and welcome back to another Blender tutorial. This is the second sensor spotlight. Today we're going to be looking at the Actuator Sensor, what it's used for, and what sort of attributes you can use for it in Python. So before we get started, I'd just like to point out that if you want to skip to any part of the tutorial at any time, there is that annotation menu bar on the top of the video. So a lot of you guys requested that I offer an example with each of these sensors as well, so that's what we're going to look at right now. So you can see I have this keyboard sensor with a spacebar press, and that's wired straight through to an action actuator. Then I have this actuator sensor, and that is looking at the action actuator, and that is wired into a Nand controller. And then that is wired into another action actuator that is just simply playing that animation in reverse. So what we see when we play the game is I hit spacebar, the cube plays an action, and then it plays it in reverse. So now we're going to take a look at more or less why it does this. Okay, so here we are looking at the actuator sensor. And you'll notice we have the same buttons as the always sensor, so I'm not going to cover those. But we have this new parameter here, and what it is expecting is an actuator. So this is really easy. If you just click, you can get a list of all of the actuators that are currently on the object, and you can select any actuator that you want to focus on. So this is basically saying what actuator this sensor should look at. Okay, so the actuator sensor is a pretty basic one. So what does it do? Well, the sensor becomes positive for as long as this actuator is activated. And then the sensor becomes not positive whenever the actuator, and this sensor becomes not positive when the actuator that it is focusing on is deactivated. One thing you should take note of is that the actuator that you choose has to be on the same object as the actuator sensor. So really the actuator sensor by itself is not that useful, because if I would just use the actuator sensor by itself, I could just wire this keyboard sensor into the other controller. However, whenever we use the actuator sensor in combination with a Nand controller, it becomes fairly useful because we can detect when an actuator is finished. So for instance, in our example, we are detecting when this action has completed. So you could figure out when your player has finished playing an animation or when a sound has finished playing. Now in this example, all we're doing is we're playing the animation in reverse then, but you could do anything you wanted there. So now we are going to jump over into Python and see what sort of attributes are useful for the actuator sensor. Okay, so here we are inside of Python, and these are some of the attributes that you can use for the actuator sensor. And you'll notice that it looks fairly empty, and that's because the actuator sensor doesn't really have that many settings for it. Now it's going to have all of the same attributes as the always sensor, so you can click the annotation on the screen to go there, or just go to that video at another time. So there is actually only one unique configuration attribute for the actuator sensor, and that is the actuator attribute. And you'll notice that I labeled this as a configuration attribute, and if you remember, a configuration attribute is basically going to be the same settings as you get from the logic editor. So, as we can see, if we open a logic editor window, we have the actuator parameter here on the sensor, and we also have the actuator attribute here in the script. And so you can assign this to a variable, and this will return a string with the name of the actuator that's being used. And as you can see here, we can also assign what actuator we want to look for using a string as well. And in this example, we are looking for the action actuator. So that is a basic overview of the actuator sensor and just one of the attributes you can use for it in Python. Next time we are going to be looking at the collision sensor, If you want to see some more information about the Actuator Sensor, there is a link in the description below. Also, if you'd like to suggest a future tutorial, there is also a link in the description for that. Real quick scheduling note, I plan on getting these videos out Tuesday and Thursday, and possibly Saturday as well. So that would be 3 sensor spotlights a week, and then we'll move on to the controllers and actuators. So, like I said, next time we are going to be looking at the collision sensor, but until then, I'm going to thank you very much for watching, and have a nice day.